Hey everybody, welcome back to part 3 in my Unlocking the Fretboard series. In this episode, we are going to discuss what I feel is probably one of the most important topics and one of the most important things to master on our guitars to become a better lead player, rhythm player, and I guess just a better overall player, period. And that is the use of arpeggios, okay? In lesson 1, we talked about recognizing interval shapes all over the fretboard, which on its own maybe didn't seem like the most useful piece of information. It might have seemed interesting, but then if we didn't have a way to apply it to anything, then it may not have been something that got us any sort of positive benefit to our guitar playing. In lesson number 2, though, what I did is we started talking about kind of chord chemistry or chord construction theory, and how different chords are built and made using those previously discussed interval shapes. Then it started kind of making a little more sense because we could see how we could apply both of those things together to create chords, create arpeggios, and just unlock the fretboard in a way that we're going to be able to navigate our way around in a much more fluent fashion or in an easier way. So let's talk now how we can take those two pieces of information, the interval patterns and the knowledge of chord chemistry, let's call it, or chord construction theory, and how we can actually now find ways to instantly figure it out on our fingerboard in a musically useful fashion. You know, all this music theory is only as good as how quickly we can apply it in a real musical situation. You know, there's lots of people who know tons about music theory, but they don't know how to apply it. Kind of useless other than to have knowledge up here in our head, right? Which my take has always been it's got to be usable. It's got to be something we can put on our instrument and make music with. That's the ultimate goal, in my opinion. So what is an arpeggio? Well, quite simply, an arpeggio is when we play the notes of a chord separately, you know, in succession, one after another. Now you might say, well, what is the use of that? Well, if we think about a lead guitar perspective, let's say, when we're soloing, we oftentimes think very sort of scale-centric, right? I'm going to be in the A minor pentatonic scale, or I'm going to play with an A major scale, or a B Dorian scale, or whatever the scale we have in our mind. Well, that scale within it has a whole bunch of arpeggios, right? And when we're going to play with these scales over top of a chord progression, we are playing over top of chords. So what if we had a way to know, hey, I'm playing over, a C major chord. Where do all the notes of just the C major chord, the so-called chord tones, lay on the fretboard? And that would give us a way to always be able to land on those tones or outline those tones, maybe with, other notes sprinkled in from the scale. But it's going to allow us to possibly, end a phrase on a scale tone or create new and interesting lines and just come up with new shapes to get under our fingers that we can practice so our fingers just, instantly go to where they need to go. Okay, so if we take the two pieces of information we talked about in lesson 1 and 2, and please go back and watch those videos. I'll have the links to them in the description below. It's almost necessary to have that knowledge before we go on to talk about what we're going to talk about today. But if we take a look at that info and how we can create arpeggios, take for instance, if I was here on A, and I'm just going to use A. We're going to talk about major and minor arpeggios today, okay? In future lessons, we're going to expand out into more complicated chords or extended chords like we talked about last time. But for now, we're going to worry about triads only, and triads being a 3-note chord or a 3-note arpeggio. And we're just going to use A in this example just because it's the first letter of the alphabet and then the musical alphabet. So if we grab A here, the root note being on the 6th string, last time or the time before we talked about our interval patterns. So we know that we need, from last lesson, a 1, a 3, and a 5, or, a first, a major third, and a perfect fifth to create a major arpeggio or a major chord. So if I start on A and I know that this is a 3 right here, that little arpeggio, right? That's a 5. Now, that's fine, but the problem is those notes all lie kind of, 2 of them anyways, on the same string, right? So we could move these around. I also know that there's a 5th back here, as we talked about in our previous lessons. So go back and take a look at those. So now I have a little arpeggio pattern. And I can always go an octave higher. There's our octave pattern. I always like to do this when I'm playing these little 3-string arpeggios. Bit of a big stretch. We don't have to keep this finger rooted back here, tied to the fretboard, right? Okay, so there we have a little A major arpeggio. Now, you know, a lot of folks will recognize this kind of as that, you know, C major shape, the start of it, from this sort of caged system that gets a lot of attention. It's a great system, but so some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, you're going to see how it applies back to this sort of famous caged system. But I'm just thinking in a different way. This is the way I'm trying to let you guys into my head and see how I'm thinking while I'm coming up with ideas and improvising and playing scales. So what we're going to do, as I showed there, is we're going to look at, first of all, some of the really common arpeggio patterns that are used, and then we're going to break them down into a more musical fashion. So let's start off by talking about some of the very common patterns that are used. I'm going to start here with, and I'm going to refer a lot to either root notes being on the 6th string or the root note being on the 5th string. So I may just say root 6th, root 5th. When I say that, I'm referring to the string it's on. I like to think, and let's go back to our A note here. So I'm at the 5th fret on the 6th string, A. I like to think of having an arpeggio pattern that sits behind or on the lower frets, leaning towards the lower frets, and then an arpeggio pattern that leans towards the frets in front of the root note. Okay, so if we go through our interval patterns, we can come up with sort of a back-facing arpeggio pattern starting on A here, and I'd go 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. So we see this little shape, okay, kind of based off of, if we're thinking caged system, off of an open G major chord, right? And you'll see the diagrams up on the screen. So that's one pattern I want to commit to memory, practice. Doesn't have to be fast. Remember, I'm not doing this as some sort of sweep picking primer or lesson. I did one of those a long time ago. This is not about that. This is not about sitting here saying, how fast can I play my arpeggios? It's not about that type of a thing. This is about knowing our fretboard and being able to utilize these notes in a musical fashion, just so we can map the fretboard out mentally like we would with a scale, but in a more musical way, all right? So we have this as our first pattern. Fine. Now we have one that's going to lean forward, and that pattern would be this. And I'm going to go 1 and 3, but I'm going to do the 3rd. We talked about this in our first lesson. 1 and 3 on the same string. 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. And then there's a 3 up there as well. Okay, so there's our, now, our other A major, sort of type 1 and type 2, I guess we can call it. So what I've covered now, if you notice, I've gone all the way from covering all the notes in an A major chord from the 2nd fret all the way up to the 9th fret, right? Wow, that really opens things up. And I know that that fits over an A major scale. Gives me a way to be able to know where those chord tones are right away within my scale. All right, well now we also have 2 patterns for major that are going to be based off of the root note being on the 5th string. Okay, so again, I can go up here 12th fret, find my, on the 5th string and find my A. This pattern would be like this. 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5. Okay, you'll recognize some of these patterns. You know, so many of the folks out there that play these, it's all about sweeping as quick as they can, right? Which is fine, it sounds good like that, but I mean, this isn't the purpose of this again. So now I was thinking with this pattern, all the way up from my 2nd fret to the 12th fret. Well now, that was starting on the root 5th and leaning backwards. I'm going to lean forwards now to sort of the type 2 of this, and I go here and I do a similar idea to what I did here. 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. Okay, where does that get us? Well, back up here to the 5th fret, right? Now, if I go 12 frets higher than where I started on my 5th fret, I'm up here, can't I just repeat this pattern? Because I'm an octave higher. And And then I could take the pattern I did back here and repeat it up here, starting on 12 frets higher again. Now I've covered the entire fretboard with an arpeggio pattern, right? Very useful, and I've mapped that fretboard. If I can get to know those really well, it opens up a lot of possibilities. We're going to take this a step further though, bear with me a second. So that's the major patterns. You've seen those up on the screen. I'm going to have a download package available on my website again with all of these patterns if anybody wants to go grab it, okay, just to have a hard copy of it, or you can just watch the video. Now, we also learn in our chord construction that we can take those major patterns and turn them into minor very simply by flattening the third interval, right? Or making it a minor third instead of a major third. So what that would look like if we go back to our first arpeggio pattern, here was our third. Well, what we have to do now is we have to flatten all the thirds, right? So we had a third here, we had a third here. I'm going to flatten this third by moving it back a fret. I'm going to flatten this third by moving it back a fret, but I'm going to move it up to this string. So the pattern will now be like this. Okay, I go forward of the root note. Again, I flatten this third. So here's the major. Here's the minor. Okay, so we have minor. All right. Then I go up to where I had my other A major with the root on the fifth. Major was this. There's my third, and there's my third. I got to flatten both of those. So, okay, major, minor. All right, and then I go up to this one where I had major again, such as like that. Now minor, I'm going to flatten the third and flatten another third here. And then again, I can just repeat, right? The same patterns as I had back there. So now I've covered the whole fretboard with major and minor patterns. So the thing to do is to get to know those patterns so we don't have to think about them, so they're effortless. Now, what is the downside to learning these sort of big, long, full patterns? Well, one thing is anybody who goes to YouTube and just you know, Google sweep picking, you're gonna find somebody out there who's gonna just be like trying to rip through these as quickly as possible, right? And then stringing them together. You know, it's this type of a thing. Fine, it's a great exercise. It might be impressive, although I find it's less impressive now that, you know, so many folks can just do this so effortlessly. But again, that's kind of the equivalent to taking a scale pattern and you know, and sort of whipping up and down that as quickly as we can. There's no musical value to it. You know, sort of the longer I've been playing, as much as I love technical playing growing up, and, you know, sort of I'm glad I, you know, worked up my ability to play at a certain level of proficiency technically. You know, musically, it starts to get a little bit boring after we watch somebody just sort of run up and down scales and arpeggios, right? So the danger I find a lot of times with these kind of long arpeggio patterns is people just tendency to play straight through them up and back as fast as they can, and they kind of lose any musical value or benefit, in my opinion. You know, some folks may love it. I mean, it is nice watching somebody who can play so effortlessly and proficiently with great technique. But how could we take these and possibly make them into something that's going to be more musically valuable, and possibly even just, like I said, this series is about unlocking the fretboard, really giving us a way to unlock our ability to move around the fretboard easily. One thing I really like to do is to break these down into 3-note per string patterns all over the fretboard and map them out in a very easy way. And what I mean by that is we're going to learn a major and a minor arpeggio on strings 6, 5, and 4. One on 5, 4, and 3, one on 4, 3, and 2, and one on 3, 2, and 1. But not just one on each, but 3 on each. Now you might say, well, why 3? Well, how many notes are there in a triad? Well, there's 3 notes, right? So if you think about it, I could do patterns where I start with, in the case of strings 6, 5, and 4, let's say, where I have the root note on the 6th string. Great. But what if I could also do one where the root note is on the 5th string, but still utilizing strings 6, 5, and 4? And what if I could do one where I have the root note on the 4th string, still utilizing those 3? I'm going to have 3 distinct shapes placed on the fretboard in various places that are going to allow me to be able to access this arpeggio regardless of where I am on the fretboard and where I'm improvising. So if I'm back here, you know, maybe thinking about a scale pattern, I've got a bunch of arpeggio shapes that I can visualize right there. If I'm up in this neck of the woods, I have a whole bunch of arpeggio shapes I can visualize up there as well, if that makes sense. I think you'll see what I mean by that. So let's start. Let's start with strings 6, 5, and 4. And please watch on the screen. I'm going to have all these diagrams up there, and these will all be the diagrams in the download package that's available on my website after you watch this. So starting with the root note, again, we're going to be using A. Starting with the root note at our 6th string, we take sort of the bottom part of this long pattern that we just talked about, right? Remember? So we're going to take this, but I'm going to always add the octave in, as I kind of touched on earlier in the video, to the root note, or to the first note actually, because you'll see how it changes up in the other one. So this one would be 1, 3, 5, 1. Now this is going to be a big stretch here, but you got to remember these are movable, right? I could do this up here. All of a sudden that stretch isn't such a big deal. The other thing is I'm doing them in A, but as long as we know where the root note is, we can move these around anywhere. I could do it in C, there's C. You know, D, E, wherever. So these are movable. I'm just using A as an example just to get the patterns under our fingers, right? So there's our first shape. Know it, memorize it, get to know it. And you're going to see how useful this is in a second, because we're not just learning one pattern here. We're going to learn something that can be used all over the place. And there's a lot less work involved in what we're trying to accomplish here than you might think. So we have the notes, if we think in actual note terms, A, C sharp, and E. Okay, well what if I move over now and I say I'm going to go up to a C sharp note, because that's this note from this pattern. And I'm going to do that one on my 6th string. It's not a root note, but it's the lowest note, right? So this, you know, in real musical terms would be an A major arpeggio with a C sharp in the bass, or written A/C sharp, right? But if we can find those same notes now, A, C sharp, and E, we'll notice we have a pattern right here, which is also an A major arpeggio, just starting with the C sharp in the bass. So our root note for this would be right here. And that makes sense too, because we look back here, we went up to that note, right? That's the root note to the octave to the root note. So we also have this. What if we started then, we know that we've started on A, we started on C sharp, but we have one note left, E. What if we go up to that? Well, this pattern is going to look like this. Notice I always add the octave in just to finish the pattern off and give us one extra note to kind of reverse things. Yeah, there's a couple ways to finger this. You're going to have to find out what's best for you. I could bar, or I could, you know, and we'll recognize this kind of as the E major shape from our caged system, right? Get it? And so basically, and then it starts over. We're running out of frets. So we've covered our whole fretboard, right? Okay, so we need to commit those to memory. Know them just like that instantly, so there's no thought involved. So the way I do that is I just play through them as such. I pick A and I go. Right? And then I do that until I'm comfortable. Moving them effortlessly all over the place. Okay, what happens when we move to strings 5, 4, and 3? Here's the beauty of this. Those patterns, the shapes of them, are going to stay identical, okay? They're just going to be moved to different places. So this pattern will now move to here, because I'm going to start on A. Pretty simple, right? This pattern, starting on C sharp, will now start right here. But I didn't have to learn a new pattern, right? and I can move around very effortlessly. This pattern starting on the E would now start here. And so now on strings 5, 4, and 3, we have this. And then again, we run out of frets, but we see all those patterns, right? So now we have all the same patterns across strings 6, 5, and 4, and 5, 4, and 3. Okay, and that covers a huge amount of information for us, right? Okay, so now we move on to strings 4, 3, and 2. Now, if you remember when we talked about interval shapes, because of the tuning discrepancy on the guitar between the second and third strings, whenever we incorporate that second string, any patterns we learned on previous strings, the interval on that particular string gets shifted up a fret to make up for the tuning discrepancy on the guitar. Please go back and watch the video. I give a sort of a lengthier explanation as to that. So if we take these patterns that we know now up here, instead of having this kind of stretched out pattern on that string, we'd have, if we move it down, we'd have to move this in. So what we end up with is this pattern. And if I start on A right here, and that goes for the other patterns as well, okay? Instead of having this one, this note here would have to be slid in, so. And there's our A major arpeggios on strings 4, 3, and 2. So we have this. Okay, and we can see these are all fragments of those longer patterns we learned. Right? But we're learning them in smaller pieces or fragments to be able to use them in a more musical fashion. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. So here on strings 4, 3, and 2, we have. And that covers our whole fretboard there. Okay, so then we move up to strings 3, 2, and 1. All right, so again, if we look at the pattern that we just did, we move that up, we need to move the second string up a fret again. So we end up with, if we start on A up here, you'll see the diagram, I have it notated back here at the second fret, an octave lower. And this one incorporates an open string, but we can still think of it as the same pattern. Watch, I obviously don't need to press here on my open string, but just for the sake of the pattern, you know, it would be more performed like that if we needed to, but it's also up here. We can see it, right? Okay. We would also have one with our A major, A right here, but our E as the lowest note. Okay, and that covers the entire fretboard. So now you can see, I can go through all of these. And be able to effortlessly find all of these major arpeggios anywhere on the fretboard. It also does something else for us. It gives us new chord fragments we can use when we're looking for the ability to play smaller chords. You know, if somebody says, play me an A major chord, do we want to only be able to do this all the time, or this, right? See, now I have the ability to come up here and go, and move around the fretboard effortlessly from rhythm playing, rather than just always being stuck with kind of the old cowboy chord, open position chords, right? But I also have these arpeggios here. You know, here I saw the A major, but I didn't use all the notes. I just did the couple intervals that I wanted, right? The 1 and the 3, okay? So you can kind of see how I'm using these little fragments. And be able to know where those A major arpeggios are anywhere. And like I said, this can be used for anything. You need to practice them not just for A, obviously, right? You could take C major, you know? So there's the same shapes, nothing's changed, right? So there's a C major arpeggio, right? And then we could say, okay, well the notes here are, you know, C, E, and G. So I can go up to E. Do the same shapes, right? And we can do that all over the fretboard. Right? Doesn't matter. As long as we know the shapes and where the root notes are, we can move those around effortlessly and have all these other chords. Again, C majors. Have all these shapes effortlessly under our fingers. Okay, so what about minor? Okay, so we would take all of those and move the 3s back a fret or make them into flat 3s. And that's the beauty of understanding the interval shapes, right? So let's run through those. So we start on A again. I'm going to have an A minor pattern here. If you notice, it's the same thing as major, but I've just moved the 3rd back a fret. Okay, same with this one. Here was the major. There's my 3rd, I move it back a fret, and I move the other 3rd up here, the octave of it up back a fret as well. And then I can start one on E as well. And that's that one, right? I have my, and then back up to where I started from, an octave higher. So, this sort of shape 1. There's our minor patterns, right? The same shapes are going to be on strings 5, 4, and 3. Same things, right? Strings 4, 3, and 2. Similar shapes again. And again, it gives us ways to find, you know, our minor chords having more possibilities. At our fingertips, right? So, our minor shapes, okay? And then up on strings 3, 2, and 1. So here's the A root note being on the 1st string. Root note being on the 2nd string. And again, you see where these are coming from, right? From the bigger patterns we talked about earlier. Okay, and then, again, using, you know, sort of the phantom finger on the open string here. So again, we have all sorts of you can move around and locate these chords anywhere. Okay, so let's take the A minor then, for instance, and apply it maybe to sort of, so we can see a real world example of this. Let's say I'm playing in my A minor pentatonic scale. I made it a blues scale. Anyways, so what we can see is I'm here in my, well, I already see this little A minor arpeggio. Hidden kind of inside of there. Did you catch that? So I'm playing some bluesy licks. So I did this arpeggio. There was an A minor arpeggio, one of the patterns. Okay, so that gives us an ability within, you know, a framework such as the pentatonic scale that we know really well to locate these arpeggio patterns. If I'm back here in this shape, I'm probably overtly, you know, overusing it there just as an example, but you sort of see how it opens up some possibilities. So it gives us the ability to move around effortlessly as little chords, like I was saying. And incorporate them into lead ideas as well, and to just visualize our fingerboard in new ways, right? We don't even have to play it kind of in that sweeping manner. We can change the order of the notes with hybrid picking or something, you know? If we have this. So if you see I'm playing the root note here, I'm jumping to the second string, then coming back to the third string instead of. Gives us new melodic ideas, right? And again, if we do want to do some crazy sweep with them, we can. So. What do you guys think? I hope that was helpful. In coming lessons, we're going to expand upon those. So I really want everybody to get to know those really well, and then we're going to add more color tones to them, turn them into seventh arpeggios, right? And again, in a very easy fashion. So for now, what you want to do is you want to go through and just memorize these shapes and patterns to the best of our ability. Get them under our finger, practice them all over the fretboard. If you have a hard time knowing the notes in your fretboard, I have a video on my channel quite some time ago, which was just called Mastering the Fretboard, which lays out very easily a way that we can visualize our fretboard and know our notes anywhere. And you see why that's important, to be able to find our root notes and then use our interval patterns and our chord knowledge to be able to create chords, to be able to create arpeggios that are going to be able to be used in a musical fashion. So. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please, I really think these videos could be helpful to a lot of folks, so please consider sharing them with anybody who you might think would like them. And if you have any questions, leave me some comments. Like the video if you don't mind. I really appreciate all the kind words and the support. I have the download package with the lesson content up on my website if anybody wants to go grab that. It's in the store there. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in as always. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you found the video useful. I'll be back soon with some more content. Ciao for now, guys. Thanks.